We now turn to sociological and philosophical socialist literature, once again touching on but a few works which exerted the greatest influence on the development of chiastic socialism. Jean Meslier's Testament stands out among writings of this type by many aspects of its composition, by its unusual fate, as well as by the astonishing figure of its author. Throughout his adult life, Jean Meslier, 1664–1729, was a priest in Champagne. His testament became known in copies and excerpts only in 1733, after his death. Voltaire and other representatives of the Enlightenment found the book of great interest, but so dangerous that they never dared to publish its complete text. The first full edition appeared only in 1864, in Amsterdam. The main distinguishing feature of the Testament is that its socialist conception is merely an outgrowth of the central idea of the work, the struggle with religion. Meslier saw nothing in religion other than a social role, which consists, in his opinion, of the furtherance of violence and social inequality by means of deceit and propagation of superstitions. Quote, "In short, all that your theologists and priests preach to you with such eloquence and fervor. All this is in reality nothing but illusion, error, falsehood, fabrication, and deception. These things were first invented by sly and cunning politicians, repeated by impostors and charlatans, then given credence by ignorant and benighted men from the common folk, and finally supported by the power of monarchs and the mighty who connived at the deceit and error, superstitions and fraudulence, and perpetuated them by their laws so as to bridle the masses in this way and make them dance to their tune." End quote. These two passions, hatred for God and for any kind of inequality or hierarchy, are the driving forces of the Testament. Meslier considers religion to be responsible for the majority of human misfortunes. In particular, it sows dissent and promotes religious wars. But at the same time, he himself calls with sincere conviction for an uprising, the killing of kings, and the annihilation of all who could be considered more fortunate and prosperous. Quote, "In this connection, I am reminded of the wish of one man who expressed the desire that all the mighty of this world and the noble lords be hanged and strangled with loops made of priests' bowels. This judgment is certainly somewhat coarse and harsh, but there is some naive frankness about it. It is brief but eloquent, and in a few words expresses what people of this kind really deserve." End quote. To Meslier, religion was an absurd superstition that cannot survive the slightest brush with reason. Of all the religions, the most absurd is the religion of the Christians, whom he calls Christ worshippers. But it would be wrong to seek the reason for this attitude in an overly rationalistic turn of mind of the author. Refuting Christianity, Meslier is at the same time ready to believe the wildest superstitions and to repeat the most absurd rumors. For instance, it seems nonsensical to him that God could have had but a single son, while much lesser creatures are much better endowed. Many animals bear 10 or 12 offspring at once. Quote, "They say that a Polish countess named Margaret has given birth to 36 babies at once. And a Dutch countess, also Margaret, who had laughed at a poor woman burdened with children, gave birth to as many children as there are days in the year, that is, 365, and all of them later got married." End quote. It is clear that Meslier's point of departure is a hatred for God, and that his arguments are merely an attempt to justify this sentiment. The person of Christ is especially hateful to him, and here he literally runs out of terms of abuse. Quote, "And what of our God and Christ worshippers? To whom do they ascribe divinity? To the paltry man who had neither talent, nor intelligence, nor knowledge, nor skill, and was utterly scorned in the world. Whom do they ascribe it to? Shall I say? Indeed I shall, they ascribe it to the lunatic, demented, wretched bigot and ill-starred gallows bird." End quote. The champion of the rights of the poor perceives irrefutable proof of Christ's teaching in the fact that, quote, "He was always poor, and was merely the son of a carpenter." End quote. Religion is the source of most social evils and, in particular, of inequality, which is maintained solely by its authority. Meslier recognizes the need for, quote, "some dependence and subordination," end quote, in every society. But at present, power is based on violence, murder, and crime. In his testament there is nothing said about concrete measures for improving the position of the poor nor about the rich doing something to help. The book merely fans the hatred of the former for the latter. Quote, "You are told, dear friends, about devils, they frighten you with the devil's name alone, you are forced to believe that devils are the most evil and repulsive of creatures, that they are the worst enemies of humankind, that they strive only to ruin people and render them unhappy in hell forever. But know, dear friends, that for you the most evil and true devils, those you ought to fear, are those people of whom I speak. You have no worse and no more evil enemies than the noble and the rich." End quote. The essence and true cause of inequality is private property, which also is justified by religion. Quote, "For this reason some drink and stuff themselves, wallowing in luxury, while others die from starvation. For this reason some are almost always happy and gay, while others are eternally sad and grieving." End quote. Messlier's entire social program comes down to a few lines. Quote, "What a great happiness it would be for people if they used all life's blessings together." End quote. In a just society, Meslier feels, production and consumption must be organized according to principles of communality. Quote, "People ought to possess all wealth and riches of the earth together and on equal terms and also use them together and equitably." End quote. Food, clothing, education for children, ought not to differ greatly in different families. Everyone ought to work under the guidance of wise elders. In another passage, Meslier speaks about elected officials. These measures would lead to miraculous results. No one would be in need, everyone would love his neighbor. Heavy work, deceit, vanity, would all disappear. Then, Meslier says, quote, "No unhappy people would be seen on earth, whereas at present we come across them on every hand." End quote. Family relations would also change, for a great evil introduced by the Church would fall away the indissolubility of marriage. Quote, "It is necessary to provide the identical freedom to men and to women to come together without hindrance, following their own inclination, and the freedom also to separate and leave one another when life together becomes intolerable or when a new attraction moves them to contracting a new union." End quote. Meslier's testament leaves the impression of a profoundly personal work revealing intimate aspects of its author's personality. Therefore, the passages that bear directly on this personality are especially interesting. The book opens with Meslier addressing his parishioners. Quote, "Dear friends, during my lifetime I was unable to say openly what I have thought about the order and method of governing men, of their religion and their rights, for this would have been fraught with highly dangerous and lamentable consequences. Therefore, I decided to tell you this after my death." End quote. Meslier says of himself, quote, "I never was so foolish as to attach any significance to the sacraments and absurdities of religion. I have never felt bent to take part in them or even to speak of them with respect and approval." End quote. Quote, "With all my heart I detested the absurd duties of my profession and especially the idolatrous and superstitious masses and nonsensical and ridiculous Holy Communion that I was obliged to perform." End quote. The book ends with these words. "After all I have said, let people think about me, let them judge me and say of me and do whatever they please. I do not care. Let people adapt themselves and govern themselves as they please, let them be wise or mad, let them be kind or evil, let them speak of me as they please after my death. I will have nothing to do with it at all. I have given up almost any participation in the things of the world. The dead with whom I will travel the same road are troubled by nothing, they care for nothing. And with this nothing I shall end here. I myself am not more than nothing and soon will be, in the full sense of the word, nothing." End quote. These were not idle words. Meslier committed suicide at the age of 65. The history of the Testament is curious. Its full text, or perhaps a series of extracts, came into the hands of Voltaire, who was greatly impressed. He wrote of the work, quote, "This is a composition of absolute necessity for demons, an excellent catechism of Beelzebub. Know that it is a rare book, a perfection." End quote. To those he called brethren, Voltaire wrote repeatedly, urging them to circulate extracts from the Testament. Quote, "Know that God's blessing is on our nascent church. In one of the provinces, 300 copies of Meslier have been distributed, which has produced many new converts." End quote. The work was thought to be dangerous. In arguing for its publication, Voltaire wrote, quote, "Is it impossible, without compromising anyone, to turn to that good old soul Merlin? I would not wish for any of our brethren to take the slightest risk." End quote. And quote. Let us thank the good people who distribute it gratis and pray to the Lord to bless this useful reading. End quote. And quote. You have clever friends who would be not unwilling to have this book in a safe place, moreover, it is suitable for the edification of youth. End quote. And quote. Jean Meslier must convince the whole world. Why is his gospel so little circulated? You are too retiring in Paris. You are hiding your lamp. End quote. And quote. In a Christian fashion, I wish for the testament of the priest to be multiplied like the 5 loaves to nourish 4 or 5,000 souls. End quote. Later, in 1793, when the convention was carrying out a program of dechristianization and introducing the cult of reason, Anaxarchus Cloots proposed putting up in the Temple of Reason a statue of the first priest to reject religious error. Quote the brave, magnanimous, and great Jean Meslier. End quote. The Code of Nature or the True Spirit of the Law by Morelli appeared in 1755. Almost nothing is known about the author. Arguments are still going on as to whether he ever existed or whether Morelli is simply a pseudonym. At the root of Morelli's system is a notion about the natural state or the quote, Code of Nature. End quote. To which mankind should adhere in order to live a moral and happy life. The breaking away from the natural state was caused by private property, the cause of all human misery. Only by abolishing it will mankind return to its natural and happy state. Part 4 of the work contains a system of laws which, according to Morelli, ought to serve as the foundation of an ideal society. A central place is occupied by 3 quote, fundamental and inviolable laws. End quote. The first abolishes private property. An exception is made only for things which a person uses, quote, for his needs, his pleasures, or his daily work. End quote. The second law proclaims all the citizens to be public persons whom the state provides with work and maintenance. The third law proclaims universal obligatory service, quote, in conformity with the distributive laws. End quote. All citizens from the age of 20 to 25 are obliged to be engaged in agriculture, they are then either retained in their place or made artisans. At the age of 40, everyone has the right of free choice of profession. Everything produced is distributed through communal storehouses. Trade and barter are forbidden by the quote, inviolable law. End quote. The population lives in towns broken up into equal blocks. All buildings are of the same shape. Everyone wears clothing of the same fabric. On reaching a certain age, everyone is to marry. Children are brought up in the family until the age of 5, then they are placed in institutions designated for their further upbringing. The training, as well as the food and clothing, of all children is absolutely the same. At the age of 10, children move to workshops to continue their training. The number of persons who devote themselves to science and the arts is strictly limited. Quote, for each type of occupation and for each town as well. End quote. What Morelli calls moral philosophy is limited once and for all to the propositions worked out in Morelli's treatise. Quote, nothing will be added beyond the limits prescribed by law. End quote. On the other hand, unrestricted freedom of investigation is granted in the area of natural science. The laws set forth by Morelli are to be engraved on columns or pyramids erected in the main square of each town. Anyone attempting to change the sacred laws is to be declared mad and immured in a cave for life. Quote. His children and all his family will renounce his name. End quote. We have already come across all these propositions in More and Campanella. But Morelli's system is of interest in that it contains the idea of the development of society from a primitive state to socialism. Mankind once lived in a natural state, the Golden Age, the memory of which is preserved among all peoples. But this state was lost due to the mistaken introduction of private property by legislators. A return to a condition where no private property exists will take place thanks to progress, which Morelli considers to be the basic driving force of history. Quote. The phenomena that I observe demonstrate everywhere, even in a gnat's wing, the presence of a consistent development. I feel the progress of reason. I am justified, therefore, to say that by some miraculous analogy there also exist favorable transformations in the moral field, and that despite their power and pleasantness, the laws of nature do only gradually gain complete power over mankind. End quote. Only after having experienced various forms of rule will the people understand what is truly good. The society described by Morelli will arise ultimately, as an inevitable triumph of reason, and mankind will come to the end of its journey from the unconscious Golden Age to the conscious one. The spread of socialist ideas in the Age of Enlightenment may be judged by the open sympathy with which they are referred to in the most influential work of the day, the famous Encyclopedia. In an article on quote, The Legislator. End quote. The author of which is apparently Diderot, the fundamental goal of every legislator is described as the replacement of the quote, spirit of property by the quote, spirit of community. End quote. If the spirit of community is dominant in a state, its citizens do not regret that they have rejected their own will for the sake of the common will. Love for their homeland becomes their only passion. These somewhat vague pronouncements are rendered more concrete by references to the laws of Peru as models of laws based on the spirit of community. Quote. The laws of Peru strove to unite the citizens by bonds of humanity, while the legislation of other countries forbid doing harm to another. In Peru the laws prescribe tirelessly doing good. Laws establishing, to the extent possible in the limitations of a natural state, the communality of property weakened the spirit of property, the source of all evil. The most festive days in Peru were those days when the common field was being tilled, the field of an old man or an orphan. He who was punished by not being permitted to work in the common field considered himself a most unhappy man. Each citizen worked for all the citizens and brought the fruits of his labor to state granaries and received the fruit of other citizens' labor as reward. End quote. Later, in 1772, Diderot returned to thoughts on the socialist form of state organization. In his work Supplement au Voyage de Bougainville, he describes the life of the people of Tahiti, whose island the traveler is supposed to have visited. The savages have everything in common. They work their fields together. Marriage does not exist and children are brought up by the community. Addressing the traveler, an old Tahitian says, quote, Here, everything belongs to all, while you have preached a difference between mine and thine. Leave us our morals. They are wiser and more virtuous than yours. We do not want to exchange what you call ignorance for your useless knowledge. We have everything that we need and whatever is useful to us. Do we deserve contempt merely because we did not invent superfluous necessities? Don't inspire in us either your false necessities or your chimerical virtues. End quote. End quote. Our girls and women belong to all. A young Tahitian girl giving herself up to the delights of a young Tahitian boy's embrace would wait impatiently for her mother to undress her and bare her breasts. Without shame or fear she accepts in our presence, surrounded by innocent Tahitians, to the sound of flutes and the dance, the caresses of him who was chosen by her youthful heart and the secret voice of her feelings. Are you capable of replacing with a more worthy and greater feeling the feeling that we instilled in them and which inspires them? End quote. Diderot's attitude toward socialist theories may also be judged by the fact that when Morelli's Code of Nature was included in various collections of his works, he did not protest. This testifies not only to Diderot's moral principles but to his sympathy for socialist ideas as well. Deschamps' truth or the true system. In conclusion, we will take note of one of the theoreticians of socialism in the 18th century, the Benedictine monk Deschamps. During his lifetime, he published Letters on the Spirit of the Times, 1769, and The Voice of Reason Against the Voice of Nature, 1770, both anonymously. But his most original ideas are contained in his Truth or the True System, which remained in manuscript and was published only in our century, and in complete form only in the last few years, c. 53. Deschamps is the author of one of the most striking and internally consistent socialist systems. He is also a philosopher of the highest order, and is sometimes referred to as a precursor of Hegel. That is unquestionably correct, but while following a path similar to the one Hegel would take later, Deschamps also developed many concepts which were to be enunciated by Hegel's disciples of the left Feuerbach, Engels, and Marx. And in his conception of nothingness he anticipates in many respects the contemporary existentialists. Deschamps' outlook is very close to materialism, although it does not coincide with materialism entirely. He sees only matter in the world, but his understanding of it is unusual. Quote, "The world has existed always and will exist eternally." End quote. In it there is an unending process going on of the appearance of certain parts out of others and their destruction. Quote, "All beings emerge one out of the other, enter one into the other, and all the various species are essentially only aspects of a universal type. All beings have life in them no matter how dead they seem, for death is merely a lesser manifestation of life and not its negation." End quote. Life for Deschamps is equated to various forms of motion. He says of nature, quote, "Everything in it possesses a capacity for feeling, life, thought, reason, i.e., motion. For what do all these words mean if not the action or motion of the particles we consist of?" End quote. This determines man's place in the universe and, in particular, his freedom of action. Quote, "If we believe that we possess a will and freedom, that results, first, from the absurdity that forces us to believe in a God and consequently to believe that we have a soul which has its merits and faults before God, and, secondly, because we cannot see the inner springs of our mechanism." End quote. Deschamps considers God to be an idea created by mankind, a product of definite social relations based on private property. Religion did not exist before these relations took shape, and it will no longer exist when they are destroyed. Religion itself is not only the result of the oppression of people but also a means facilitating this oppression. It is one of the basic obstacles to the transition of mankind to a happier social condition. Deschamps says, quote, "The word God must be eliminated from our languages." End quote. Nevertheless, he was a passionate opponent of atheism. Of his system he has the following to say, quote, "At first glance, it might be possible to think that it is a concise formulation of atheism, for all religion is destroyed in it. But upon consideration, it is impossible not to be convinced that it is not a formulation of atheism at all, for in place of a rational and moral God, whom I do subject to destruction, for he merely resembles a man more powerful than other men, I set being in the metaphysical sense, which is the basis of morality that is far from arbitrary." End quote. Deschamps has in mind his understanding of the universe, to which he ascribed three specific aspects. The first is totality tout, that is, the universe as a unity of all its parts. This totality is the quote, "basis whose manifestations are all visible beings," end quote. But which has another, non-physical nature which is unlike its parts. Therefore, it cannot be seen but can be comprehended by reason. The second aspect is everything tout, that is, the universe as a single concept. Quote, "Totality presupposes the presence of the parts. Everything does not presuppose this. I understand everything as existence in itself, existence by itself. In other words, existence through nothing but itself." End quote. End quote. Everything, not consisting of parts, exists, it is inseparable from totality, which consists of parts and of which everything is simultaneously a confirmation and a negation." End quote. But perhaps the most striking of Deschamps' three aspects of the universe is the third. It stresses the negative character of definitions of everything. Quote, "Everything is no longer a mass of entities but a mass without parts. Not a single entity existing in many entities, but a singular entity which denies any existence apart from itself, about which it is possible only to deny that which is asserted in the other, for it is not sentient and not the result of sentient entities but, rather, nothing rein, non-being itself, which alone cannot be anything but the negation of what is sentient." End quote. As well as quote, "Everything is nothing." End quote. End quote. No doubt no one before me has ever written that everything and nothing are one and the same. End quote. For Deschamps, this principle is basic to his doctrine on existence. Quote, "What is the cause of existence?" Answer, its cause resides in the fact that nothing is something, in that it is existence, in that it is everything. End quote. Here he finds a place for God as well. Quote, "God is nothing, non-existence itself." End quote. Apparently, these principles, along with the deductions resulting from them, are what Deschamps opposes to atheism, which he declares a purely negative, destructive doctrine. He calls it the atheism of cattle, i.e., of beings who have not overcome religion, and who have not even developed to the level of religion. Deschamps' arrogant and scornful attitude toward contemporary philosophers of the Enlightenment is connected with this view. He accuses them of creating unscientific schemes based on fantasy. Quote, "Let our destroyer philosophers realize how futile and worthless were their efforts directed against God and religion. The philosophers were powerless to carry out their task, until they touched upon the existence of the civil condition, which alone is the cause of the appearance of the idea of a moral and universal being and of all religions." End quote. End quote. The condition of universal equality does not derive logically from the doctrine of atheism. It always seemed, to our atheists as well as to the majority of people, to be a product of fantasy. End quote. And fantasies of this sort are by no means harmless. There are only two ways out: the path proposed by religion and Deschamps' system. To undermine religion before the ground is prepared for the author's system is to hasten the coming of a destructive revolution. In the voice of reason, Deschamps says, quote, "This revolution will obviously have its source in the contemporary philosophical trends, although the majority does not suspect this. It will have much more lamentable consequences and bring much more destruction than any revolution caused by heresy. But is this revolution not already beginning? Has destruction not already befallen the foundations of religion? Are they not ready to collapse, and all the rest as well?" End quote. To the negative character of the philosophe's atheism, Deschamps opposes what he sees as the positive character of his own system. Quote, "The system I am proposing deprives us of the joys of paradise and the terrors of hell just like atheism, but, in contrast to atheism, it leaves no doubt as to the rightness of the destruction of hell and paradise. Beyond that, it gives us the supremely important conviction, which atheism does not and can never give, that for us paradise can exist only in one place, namely, in this world." End quote. Deschamps' social and historical doctrine is based on metaphysics. It is derived from a conception of the evolution of mankind in the direction of the greatest manifestation of the idea of oneness, of totality. Quote, "The idea of totality is equivalent to the idea of order, harmony, unity, equality, perfection. The condition of unity or the social condition derives from the idea of totality, which is itself unity and union. For purposes of their own well-being, people must live in a social condition." End quote. The mechanism of this evolution is the development of the social institutions which determine all other aspects of human life, language, religion, morality. For example, quote, "It would be absurd to suppose that man came from the hands of God already mature, moral and possessing the ability to speak. Speech developed along with society as it became what it is today." End quote. Desha considers various manifestations of evil to be the result of social conditions. He includes even homosexuality, for example. The social institutions themselves take shape under the influence of material factors such as the necessity of hunting in groups and the guarding of herds, as well as the advantages of man's physical structure, in particular, that of his hand. Desha divides the entire historical process into 3 stages or states through which mankind must pass. Quote, "For man there exist only 3 states, the savage state or the state of the animals in the forest, the state of law, and the state of morals. The first is a state of disunity without unity, without society, the second state ours one of extreme disunity within unity, and the third is the state of unity without disunity. This last is without doubt the only state capable of providing people, insofar as this is possible, with strength and happiness." End quote. In the savage state people are much happier than in the state of law, in which contemporary civilized mankind lives. Quote, "The state of law for us, is undoubtedly far worse than the savage state." End quote. This is true with respect to contemporary primitive peoples. Quote, "We treat them with disdain, yet there is no doubt that their condition is far less irrational than ours." End quote. But it is impossible for us to return to the savage state, which had to collapse and give birth to the state of law by force of objective causes first and foremost, by the appearance of inequality, authority, and private property. Private property is the basic cause of all the vices inherent in the state of law. Quote, "The notions of thine and mine in relation to earthly blessings and women exist only under cover of our morals, giving birth to all the evil that sanctions these morals." End quote. The state of law, in Desha's opinion, is the state of the greatest misfortune for the greatest number of people. Evil itself is considered an outgrowth of this state. Quote, "Evil in man is present only due to the existing civil state, which endlessly contradicts man's nature. There was no such evil in man when he was in a savage state." End quote. But those very aspects of the state of law that make it especially unbearable prepare the transition to the state of morals, which seems to be that paradise on earth about which Desha spoke in a passage quoted earlier. His description, replete with vivid detail, contains one of the most unique and consistent of socialist utopias. All of life in the state of morals will be completely subordinated to one goal: the maximum implementation of the idea of equality and communality. People will live without mine and thine, all specialization will disappear, as will the division of labor. Quote, "Women would be the common property of men, as men would be the common possession of women. Children would not belong to any particular man or woman." End quote. End quote. Women capable of giving suck and who were not pregnant would nurse all children without distinction. But how is it, you will object, that a woman is not to have her own children? No, indeed. What would she need that property for? End quote. The author is not alarmed by the fact that such a way of life would lead to incest. Quote, "They say that incest goes against nature. But in fact it is merely against the nature of our morals." End quote. All people, quote, "would know only society and would belong only to it, the sole proprietor." End quote. For transition into this state, much that is now considered of value would have to be destroyed, including, quote, "everything that we call beautiful works of art." This sacrifice would undoubtedly be a great one, but it would be necessary to make. End quote. It is not only the arts, poetry, painting, architecture that would have to disappear, but science and technology as well. People would no longer build ships or study the globe. Quote, "And why should they need the learning of a Copernicus, a Newton, and a Cassini?" End quote. Language will be simplified and much less rich, and people will begin to speak one stable and unchanging language. Writing will disappear, together with the tedious chore of learning to read and write. Children will not study at all and, instead, will learn everything they need to know by imitating their elders. The necessity of thinking will also fall away. Quote, In the savage state no one thought or reasoned, because no one needed to. In the state of law, one thinks and reasons because one needs to. In the state of morals, one will neither think nor reason because no one will have any need to do this any longer." End quote. One of the most vivid illustrations of this change of consciousness will be the disappearance of all books. They will find a use in the only thing that they are in reality good for: lighting stoves. All books ever written had as their goal the preparation for the book which would prove their uselessness. Des Shah's study. It will outlive the rest, but finally it, too, will be burned. People's lives will be simplified and made easier. They will scarcely use any metals, instead, almost everything will be made of wood. No large houses will be built and people will live in wooden huts. Quote. Their furniture would consist only of benches, shelves, and tables. End quote. End quote. Fresh straw, which would later be used as cattle litter, would serve them as a good bed on which they would all rest together, men and women, after having put to bed the aged and the children, who would sleep separately. End quote. Food would be primarily vegetarian and, thus, easy to prepare. Quote. In their modest existence they would need to know very few things, and these would be just the things that are easy to learn. End quote. This change of lifestyle is connected to fundamental psychic changes, which would tend to make, quote, the inclination of each at the same time the common inclination. End quote. Individual ties between people and intense individual feelings would disappear. Quote. There would be none of the vivid but fleeting sensations of the happy lover, the victorious hero, the ambitious man who had achieved his goal, or the laureled artist. End quote. End quote. All days would be alike. End quote. And people would even come to resemble one another. Quote. In the state of morals, no one would weep or laugh. All faces would be almost identical and would express satisfaction. In the eyes of men, all women would resemble all other women, and all men would be like all other men in the eyes of women. End quote. People's heads, quote, will be as harmonious as they now are dissimilar. End quote. End quote. Much more than in our case, they would adhere to a similar mode of action in everything, and they would not conclude that this demonstrates a lack of reason or understanding, as we think about animals. End quote. This new society will give rise to a new world view. Quote. And they would not doubt, and this would not frighten them in the least, that people, too, exist only as a result of the vicissitudes of life and someday are destined to perish as a consequence of the same vicissitudes and, perhaps, to be eventually reproduced once more by means of a transformation from one aspect to another. End quote. End quote. Because they, like us, would not take into account that they were dead earlier, that is, that their constituent parts did not exist in the past in human form, they would also, being more consistent than we, not place any significance on the termination of this existence in this form in the future. End quote. End quote. Their burials would not be distinguishable from those of cattle. End quote. For, quote, their dead fellows would not mean more to them than dead cattle. They would not be attached to any particular person sufficiently so that they would feel his death as a personal loss and mourn it. End quote. End quote. They would die a quiet death, a death that would resemble their lives. End quote.